So welcome, Alex, to the first On War and Society video podcast. I think it's kind of appropriate that you're my first guest, as you were actually the inaugural guest on the On War and Society audio podcast. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I don't mind being a guinea pig either.
Well, somebody has to be the guinea pig, right? So I appreciate that. It might as well be you. So we're here to talk about your new book, War Junk, Munitions Disposal and Post-War Reconstruction in Canada. Now, this is actually based on your PhD dissertation, which you conducted at the University of Western Ontario with Dr. Jonathan Vance. But I was curious, when I was reading your acknowledgement sections of the book, I learned, and I had not known this, that you had actually started your PhD dissertation looking at the post-war rehabilitation of Second World War veterans. So how did you first come across this topic?
That's actually a kind of an interesting story, a bit of a long-winded story, if you will. So I had done my master's thesis at the University of Ottawa, and I had examined the Battle of Normandy, soldiers' experiences and morale. And so it had got me well immersed, shall we say, in the trauma of combat and killing and all that sort of terrible nature of war. And I had been very interested, at least, in the recovery process. So how did these, soldiers who were all quite young, who survived the war, how did they come home and reintegrate into society? And so I had intended to research that as a process or as a part of my PhD. And after reading, in comps, book after book and article after article on the subject, I kind of got a bit of topic exhaustion, I guess. And I had a bit of an identity crisis about what I wanted to do with myself. And in my other comprehensive exams with Rob McDougall and Michelle Hamilton at Western, I had ended up reading a lot about technology and business history in American societies with Rob, and I read a lot about material culture and public history with Michelle, and they got me sort of thinking about these subjects in a lot of different ways, and I ended up starting to ask questions that I had been asking about veterans about objects. So how are objects rehabilitated when the war ended? How did they survive in post-war Canada? What is their story? And the idea was still really blurry and hazy, and I didn't really necessarily know what I wanted to do. So I wrote this really broad dissertation proposal that talked about both mobilization and demobilization. So how were these objects, acquired and procured? How did they live throughout the war? And then what happened to them afterwards? It was sort of this big, huge, overarching question. And we were in the proposal defense, and my supervisor, Jonathan Vance, and I, as well as two reviewers from the department, Rob Wardoff and Keith Fleming. And I don't, looking back on it now, I don't think the proposal was that great. And both Keith and Rob, they offered some really concerted and critical, but also very constructive and helpful feedback in working through some of these ideas. And it was a really productive discussion. And at one point, I forget who it was, who just sort of asked, well, Alex, what happens to this stuff after the war? And they looked at me. I looked at them. We looked at Jonathan Vance. We all blinked. No one in the room knew, right? And here was a group of people that had published 15, maybe 20 books between them all on Canadian history, and none of them knew what happened to these objects after the war. And it was then that I realized there was, some record groups at the Library and Archives Canada that I could start to look through, and I kind of found my path right after that. So it was almost by happy accident, actually, that I came to the subject.
Well, it's a fascinating topic and very original. I mean, there's not a lot that's been written about this. Closest thing I can think of is Peter Thorchin's Waste into Weapons, which looks more at the production rather than the afterlives of these objects. Can you give us a sense of just how how much stuff was produced during the Second World War?
So there was a massive amount of stuff. I mean, it's hard to fathom the scope or the scale, but the example that I usually use when I'm giving lectures or talking about the subject involves trinitrile toluene, what we call TNT. During the course of the war, so from about 1939 until the end of the war in August 1945, Canada produces about 144,000 tons of TNT, which is a tremendous amount. It's certainly nowhere near as much as what was produced in the States or Britain or Russia. But as a middleweight power, junior ally, Canada is producing a substantial amount. By comparison, if we were to take that 144,000 tons, put it all in one spot and blow it up in one shot, that the explosive yield that would result would be equivalent to about 8 Hiroshima-sized atomic detonations.
Wow.
So the amount of force, explosive force that Canada is producing is just a phenomenal amount of materials, and that's just explosives, right? Canada is producing 800,000 military pattern vehicles. One of the stories that a lot of people don't realize is that after Dunkirk, when the British has to leave all of their vehicles behind, it's actually Canada that ends up supplying for most of the rest of the war about 1 out of every 2 military pattern vehicles to Britain. We replenished Britain's mechanization after Dunkirk. Right, a massive amount of stuff. We're talking about a huge amount of communications equipment and other things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with munitions, but they fall under the category of supply. So you're looking at uniforms and bed frames, right, that not only were to outfit British Imperial troops, but also Canadians, which were 1.1 million strong eventually. So you're looking at a phenomenal amount of assets that then, when the war is over, you're looking at a lot of things that need to be disposed of. So, not everything had been used up during the war. Certainly not everything was needed for post-war requirements in the post-war military. And the military was also in a privileged position of picking. Like, it could pick the best supplies and then get rid of the remainder. So there's this situation where Canada has a tremendous amount of stuff left over, quite unprecedented in Canadian history.
So in looking at these objects, you basically look at them from 3 ways. One, objects that are destroyed, objects that are resold back into the Canadian economy, and then objects that are kind of recycled, essentially. What was the determining factor in whether or not an object gets destroyed, resold, or reused?
Well, it came down to a variety of issues. So on the one hand, you're looking at a very problematic economic issue. So all of this production that had taken place during the war suddenly becomes a surplus. And businesses were very, very scared about having to compete against their wartime production. So companies that had produced brass and typewriters during the war, for example, weren't interested in having that productive capacity get used up by, speculators that purchase it all at bargain prices and then resell to their clients, like the regular manufacturers who they would usually sell to and have all their prices undercut. They're very scared about deflation. And so originally what they start to do is organize the War Assets Corporation, which is the organization that my book focuses on. They start to operate under the assumption that they're going to impound all of these assets. And then they have to realize that as things start to accumulate that they can't have all these things just impounded or destroyed from the economy, that they were going to have to sell these assets within a window of opportunity. And so what they decide to do in terms of how to create these sales and destruction policies, they decide that anything that was reusable should be sold, and it should be sold as quickly as possible in order for those assets to be essentially used up before the new waves of new production start arriving. Okay? And so the idea is that they realized that businesses were going to have to, change over their factory floors. And while they're doing that, they're not producing new goods. So that there was going to be a window of opportunity where surplus assets would be essentially the only thing available in department stores. So what the government does is they establish a reverse logistics where they take these products that they had acquired and then they send them back to the point of origin. So they only sell to businesses, as well as they establish a sort of hierarchy for social interests like universities and welfare programs and housing and other things like that. They could apply for priority access, but the whole system was essentially defaulted to send these assets back through the industries that had just produced them. And it was there that decisions were made about whether or not they could sell these assets. So things that were made to military specifications weren't necessarily suitable for civilian laws. So they made the call about whether or not they needed to refurbish them, redesign them, or sell them overseas, or have them destroyed because they were never going to be able to be accommodated by civilian laws and needs and things like that. And then on the flip side, they also knew that there were things that were never going to be able to be resold, like artillery shells, machine guns, grenades, those types of things they knew that were never going to be able to be resold. And so these sort of tactical things like combat aircraft, other things like that, they couldn't sell internationally. They ended up having to destroy them because they couldn't keep assets on hand for the potential sale that they might bring at the end. So you couldn't hold an item in a warehouse, paying the rental costs for that warehouse, paying the workers' salaries to maintain and appraise those assets. Eventually, those costs were going to eclipse the price that they would make off any sale. And so this idea of destruction suddenly becomes a way of saving taxpayer money. Which is kind of ironic because the public, the taxpayers, start to say, well, why are you burning that big, huge bonfire of planes? I would have bought those things. What's wrong with you? Why are you wasting these potentials? And the War Assets Corporation's response was, well, we've been trying to sell these things for years. No one has come forward because this plane is completely obsolete, even by wartime standards, or it's like the lowest of the low technologies. And no one wants to buy them, and now it's costing us money to keep them around. So at any rate, there's like a method to the madness that's sort of occurring in the background, but the public isn't necessarily aware of these sort of methodical decisions that are taking place behind the scenes as they're deciding what to reuse and what to recycle and what to permanently destroy.
Much of the stuff that falls into the hands of the War Assets Corporation, how much of that is ultimately destroyed?
It'd be difficult to tell or give you an accurate answer. I would say that destruction has various levels to it. There's a lot of stuff that's permanently eliminated. There's a lot of stuff that's permanently eliminated before it even reaches the War Assets Corporation. And then there's a lot of stuff that gets taken apart. So it's actually quite difficult to give you a specific answer to that. There's also some evidence issues too. As much as I'd like to think that the War Assets Corporation had a phenomenal amount of records, at some point in 1950, their records were actually disposed of. So there's huge gaps in the record groups that I had to fill with a lot of digging elsewhere. So the clear picture of destruction is difficult to tell, especially because that quite often they would categorize things differently. So in my book, I talk about metal sales. And in their sales list, they provide a number of sales and weight that are within each sale of steel, but they don't always tell you how much, and sometimes they're in different tons or pounds. So you have to do a bit of conversion to get a total amount. And then you're also looking at like tanks and things, or chassis or spare parts that were sold that were actually just metal that was then recirculated into the economy. So it's actually quite difficult to give you an answer. But what I can tell you is that the disposal agencies that are created after the war in Britain, the United States, and Canada are actually some of the largest merchandising companies to have ever existed in history, but only if we account for the size of inventories. So most of the time, you know, even today for that matter, like Walmart and other companies will only carry like maybe 15,000 different types of things. So like, you know, 6 different mustards, you know, 4 different, you know, types of rice, or, you know, all these types of inventory classifications. They'll only, you know, streamline their production to give the ones that are the most profitable to their customers, right? So there's only like 15, maybe 20,000 different types of things when you walk around to Walmart inside the store. Well, the War Assets Corporation had alone over 200,000 different types of inventory classifications.
Wow.
200,000 different types of things, right? When you take apart a plane, each screw, each bolt, each, you know, each engine and all of the various parts in it, they all disassemble into different categories that then the War Assets Corporation had to deal with. And not all of those products are profitable, right? So if we're talking about, you know, these merchandising companies as a profitable venture, they're not very profitable. They're dealing with too many types of things. They couldn't specialize, essentially. And so in the end, that they did have to destroy a lot of the stuff that they thought they could recoup, right? They thought that maybe the engines and airplanes that they were disassembling might be valuable in other contexts, but testing didn't really reveal something. So something that they had actually saved in one year, they ended up having to destroy in another. So again, it's a difficult question to answer because there's so many variables at stake.
What's the process of destruction? What were the? I mean, I guess it would really depend a lot on the material you're working with. But what were some of the ways that these things were destroyed? Were they simply left in landfills? Were they broken down and repurposed? I mean, what does the destruction process look like?
So the destruction process is messy for the most part. You know, I've seen some pictures of you know, employees for the War Assets Corporation, you know, using sledgehammers and axes to take apart planes to then recycle the metals and things like that. So there's a certain level of you know, like messy destruction that takes place. Then you're also looking at a lot of incineration. So incineration was probably the cheapest method that they utilized. And it would, of course, depend on the type of asset, but in the end, it generally reduced everything. And then they would take the ashes and the debris left over and then send them to the local landfill. You're also looking at, you know, a process of scrapping where they would just take apart the whole institute, like the whole asset in itself, as well as like the Jeep or the airplane, that they would take it apart and not necessarily use sledgehammers because of the technical nature of the task. And then, of course, you're also looking at dumping. So a lot of the dangerous assets that were a little too difficult or intricate to remove, you know, or take apart, they would just throw them into the oceans. You're looking at a lot of pollution ending up in the oceans. And that's actually what I've been researching a lot since I finished the dissertation and the book. I've been looking into a lot about the story of underwater munitions and the disposal of essentially explosives that they couldn't blow up on land, they couldn't incinerate, that they would just throw into the oceans.
What is the environmental impact of this post-war demobilization?
It's a huge environmental impact. It's something that we often don't talk about. I would argue that there's an environmental history of peace that needs to be written, an environmental history of disarmament, because this process, when they're done the war, there's only a handful of methods, right? They could sell them, they could abandon them, they could burn them, they could throw them in the oceans, or they could take them apart, right? Those are essentially the only things that they can do. And there are huge costs to all those things involved. I mean, you know, selling assets overseas, you know, if they're weaponry, then you're looking at like fueling other wars, right? There's a dark side to every element of this process. And in the end, you're looking at some really significant environmental legacies, because with budgets cuts and factories closing down, the places where they could like centralize the ordnance to, you know, boil them in a profitable scale, they just didn't exist. They were all closing down. The budgets weren't there. So they had to cut corners. They had to use crude methods. So you're looking at them like cleaning out explosive materials by using other explosives and then just bringing in a backhoe and removing all the dirt and bringing it to the local landfill. That's generally how they eliminated pollution at military sites, or the pollution at munitions factories, which was quite extensive. And then you're also looking at these assets being thrown into the oceans, where they create a really significant impediment for economic development. So there's a lot of stories around the world of they need to build a pipeline in the 1990s, but all of these bombs are in the way. So they build the pipeline anyway.
Right.
And you're looking at some pretty significant potential environmental disasters. And then there's also, these assets will wash up on beaches. So there's a lot of, possibility of tourists and beachgoers. The stories pop up all the time. Fishermen catch them all the time. And then you're also looking at a slow violence too, because as these materials disintegrate, they can migrate into the surrounding marine environments, and the small microbes will eat them, or fish consume those molecules with the microbes that they're eating, and it can work its way up into the food chain. And there is some debate, at least among scientists, about whether or not underwater munitions cause a significant health risk in a sort of bioaccumulation or biomagnification. But there's definitely some issues involving conventional munitions. TNT is a huge carcinogen. So there's some really significant issues and a significant potential for these issues to be, very problematic for us today.
Was the Second World War a wasteful war, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, an incredible amount of waste that takes place in production. I mean, with every design change, as the Allies are trying to figure out the best equipment to use, you're looking at having to scrap stuff on production lines, right? That there's a lot of wasted effort in design, and there's a lot of failures and things like that. So yeah, it is certainly a wasteful war, but we can also talk about waste in many ways. There's a lot of discussion about the waste of life that takes place, the destruction of property. And I think that's something to also keep in mind. And unfortunately, it's not something I touch on too heavily in the book. But there's like 60 million people who die during the war, and I mean that's a horrific casualty toll of a lot of wasted potential. And one thing I often tell students when I teach about the subject and trying to visualize or understand the magnitude of this is, a lot of people will turn around and say, well, at least the war did this change, or at least the war brought this productive outcome, that somehow these people did not necessarily die in vain of some way, shape, or form. And at the end of the day, I'd like to point out to students that 60 million people, I mean, that's 60 million brains that never got to fulfill their potential. And who's to say there wasn't another Einstein in the bunch, right? That would have made that technological breakthrough or that scientific discovery that would enable the same developments to have existed after the war, but they didn't get an opportunity to because their life was cut short. So I like to think of that in terms of the waste of potential that takes place in the war. So yeah, the Second World War is incredibly wasteful in so many ways.
After reading your book, I started to think more deeply, or found myself more conscious of kind of the burden of our material way of life and the things we kind of take for granted. And it had me wondering how studying something like this and spending so many years on this project, how it has changed the way you kind of look at the world.
Tremendously, actually. I mean, doing some research on this, Canadians are some of the most wasteful people in the world. Studies have found that we produce like over 700 kilograms of waste per person per year, which is a phenomenal amount of waste. And having spent so much time researching how thrifty and creative people were, it was really refreshing. I definitely have to say that the book has prompted me to reconsider the ways in which I consume and the ways in which I discard things. It's certainly made the process of disposal more curious and more interesting to me. It's something that I've taken, I stopped taking for granted, I guess, and hopefully people who read the book will also start to see how planned obsolescence has dulled our curiosity for old things and dulled our abilities to, fix up or the old things, right? It's dulled our mechanical knowledge. And so I think that people might hopefully take a different view towards our consumption habits because they are unsustainable. And I would venture a guess that the way in which we consume is a direct contributor to climate change and other issues that we're facing today.
And what do you think are some of the lessons that we can draw from your study today?
Well, I think that there are some really, really important lessons, not only in terms of making the disposal process or making reverse logistics more interesting or more innovative, something to be more curious about, and that hopefully there'll be more literature or more discussion about these subjects in varieties of different contexts. But I think the big lesson at least comes from the way in which they demobilized an economy for war purposes, right? You're looking at a government that essentially had to mass mobilize a war effort, and many of these items did not exist in the Canadian economy prior to the war, or if they did, or if these companies did, or if they did exist, they were completely ravaged or closed down by the Great Depression. So you're looking at an economy or that a government that had to like rejuvenate an economy as well as build new economies and sectors within industries in order to fuel a war effort. That's certainly a lesson for climate change, right? Like, where are the crown companies that are being set up to address the issues of climate change? And it was very obvious that there was a political will to eliminate any type of voluntary organization, right? That there's a strong, firm government that is compelling the economy to do what it wants it to do, rather than the other way around. And I think that there's definitely some important lessons. There's a really good book that's coming out at the end of this year that I actually just finished reviewing by Seth Klein. It's called The Good War, and it looks at how the Second World War mobilization is a blueprint for addressing climate change. Very, very, very interesting book. But there's also lessons in how to demobilize, right? How do we demobilize the fossil fuel economy? How do we demobilize a structure, an economic way of being, and create something new, or at least morph it or change it to our needs in this sort of post-fossil fuel era, in this post-war era? And I think that there's some really interesting storylines about how people can be thrifty, how people can utilize second choice materials to improve their living standards. It also provides some warning signs about the problems that may be encountered, right? Because it's not a rosy transition, right? It's not a helpful, at least at the beginning. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of inflation. There's a lot of deflation in certain respects. There's a lot of economic issues. There's a lot of people that can't get the things that they want. So that there's a lot of people that are angry about the process. But that in the end, that this sort of transitional moment kind of works itself out as the economy's new levers start to materialize. And so I think that there are some really, really important lessons. Maybe you might have to read between some lines in the book to find them all. But I do think that this book has some really powerful lessons for today.
How do you think the world's countries have responded from the production side, from the demand for material side of this pandemic, in terms of producing things like hand sanitizer, masks, those sorts of things?
Oh, it's very, very familiar, actually, for someone who studies the Second World War, of companies, volunteering to produce a certain thing that the government needs. I mean, that's quite a common. It's a very long history that's involved in that process. So it's refreshing to see those things. It's also, I think, a pretty interesting dry run for dealing with climate change. Seeing the government compelling people to do particular things and act a particular way, and seeing certain shortages of goods and other things. It's one of those instances where eventually the government is going to have to start taking a stronger arm on climate change. And the way it's flexing its muscles right now, I think, is a way in which it might have to later, when we're dealing with the issues of climate change and other things like that. So I think that they've done a relatively good job here in Canada of transferring over certain types of production and managing and compelling and prohibiting certain aspects. And it does have a lot of things in common with the way in which the war economy was organized. I do have to also point out, however, a lot of doom and gloom about what's happening with the economy and recessions and things like that. But as somebody who's seen some of these transitions in paperwork and spent a lot of time looking at preparations for a post-war period, I kind of see some aspects of society geared towards a big boom. I think that after a period of trouble, that I think that there'll be some issues with a lot of tensions and issues in our economy as things start to reopen and some businesses aren't able to survive. That there'll be some issues that arise. But I think a couple years out there'll be a huge boom in a variety of new areas. Hopefully green technologies and other things like that. But I think that we'll come out of this pandemic stronger than when we were at the beginning.
Well, I think it would be appropriate to end on a note of optimism, especially under our current situation. It's nice to have a little positivity and a little optimism for a change.
Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. The book is absolutely fascinating. It's relevant, I think, for a lot of reasons, many of which we've discussed today. Thank you so much for joining me today.
And just one other word is the paperback version, which I'm holding right now in my hands. It is available November 1st. So the paperback copy is on its way. I know a lot of people have been asking me about it since the hardcover is a little pricey, but the paperback is on its way. It'll be a perfect Christmas gift.
I second that. I hope to see many copies of War Junk under people's Christmas trees this holiday season.
Me too.